A frail Mustang stood alone in the auction yard, his ribs visible and his spirit nearly broken. Wealthy ranchers laughed, shaking their heads. "That horse is worthless," they said. No one placed a bid. No one cared. Until one voice broke the silence. $200. The crowd turned, stunned. The poor farmer, struggling to save his own ranch, had made the bid. He was not merely purchasing a horse. He was taking a chance on something no one else believed in. This is the story of a rejected Mustang and the man who changed everything. The auction yard was alive with the sounds of shouting bidders, the heavy stomp of hooves, and the clinking of coins exchanged between eager hands under the scorching Texas sun. Wealthy ranchers stood shoulder to shoulder, observing as prize Mustangs were paraded out, each horse stronger and more majestic than the last. The air was thick with dust, sweat, and anticipation. James Carter leaned against the wooden railing, his arms crossed over his dust-covered flannel shirt. He had not come to buy a horse. In fact, he barely had enough money to keep his ranch running. Yet something had drawn him here today. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps desperation. Then he saw him. In the farthest pen, away from the prime Mustangs that commanded thousands of dollars, stood a horse no one wanted. Thin and weak, the Mustang's black coat was dull, stretched over a body too frail to belong to a wild horse. His mane hung in tangled knots, and his ribs were visible beneath his skin. Each breath he took seemed to require effort. His head hung low, his ears flicking anxiously at every sudden sound. He looked defeated. James understood that look well. He had seen it before in himself. The auctioneer's voice rang through the speakers. Lot number 42, a full-grown Mustang, though not in the best condition. James sighed, hiding his disappointment. "Let us start at $200. Silence followed. Wealthy ranchers muttered among themselves, shaking their heads. "That one is good for nothing," one man scoffed. "Not even worth the feed he would consume," another added, laughing. James exhaled. He had witnessed too many creatures written off as worthless. This Mustang was not weak. He was simply waiting for someone to believe in him. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "All right, folks, $200. Do I hear a bid?" Nothing. James looked at the horse again, and something stirred deep within his chest, a feeling he had not experienced in a long time. He lifted his hand. $200. The crowd turned in shock. Laughter rippled through the air. "Carter, you have lost your mind," a rancher called. "Spending money you do not have on a dying horse," another chuckled. James ignored them. The auctioneer barely concealed his amusement as he slammed the gavel. "Sold to James Carter for $200. As James walked toward the Mustang's pen, the murmurs and laughter faded into the background. He did not care what they thought. He had not just purchased a horse. He had given a forgotten soul a second chance. The Mustang's dark eyes locked onto his as he stepped closer. James could see the hesitation, the fear that had been beaten into him by a life of hardship. The horse did not bolt, but he did not trust him either. James moved slowly. "You are safe now," he murmured. The horse flinched slightly at his voice, but did not run. James knelt just outside the pen, lowering himself to remove any threat of dominance. The Mustang watched him carefully, nostrils flaring as he took in the scent of this new man. Minutes passed in silence. James did not move. He simply waited. Then the horse took a step forward. It was hesitant, cautious, but deliberate. James remained still, allowing the Mustang to make the choice himself. Finally, just barely, the horse leaned forward, the tip of his nose brushing against James's palm. James exhaled, his chest tightening with something he had not felt in a long time. Hope. It was not trust, not yet, but it was a start. James guided the Mustang, which he had decided to name Shadow, toward his old truck. The horse moved hesitantly, his hooves dragging slightly through the dirt. Each step appeared to be a struggle between exhaustion and fear. James understood that this would not be an easy task. He had worked with nervous horses before. However, Shadow was not merely nervous, he was broken. Carefully, James led him toward the wooden ramp that connected to his horse trailer. The Mustang froze, eyes wide and nostrils flaring. James murmured softly, "Easy, boy, it is just a ride. You are safe now." Shadow did not move. Instead, his entire body tensed. James could feel the wild energy brewing beneath his trembling muscles, the kind of energy that came from an animal ready to flee. He had seen this before. The Mustang was not afraid of the trailer itself, but of what came after. Someone had forced him into a confined space before. Someone had hurt him. James sighed. "I am not them, boy." Minutes passed, and ranchers still lingering after the auction watched, chuckling to themselves. "He is not going to load," one muttered. James ignored them. Shadow would decide when he was ready. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the Mustang took a small step forward. James held his breath. Another step, then another, and in one swift movement, Shadow climbed into the trailer. James closed the gate behind him and exhaled, running a hand through his hair. This was only the beginning. The drive home was bumpy, the old truck rattling with every pothole on the dirt road. James kept one hand steady on the wheel, the other gripping the worn leather of his steering wheel. His mind raced as fast as his heart. What had he just done? $200 might not have seemed like much to the wealthy ranchers at the auction, but to James, it was a fortune. That money could have gone toward bills, repairs on the barn, or even groceries. Instead, he had spent it on a horse no one else wanted. Deep in his gut, James knew he had done the right thing. The farm came into view, a small struggling ranch that had seen better days. The wooden fence surrounding the pastures was in desperate need of repair, the barn paint peeling, and the main house, though sturdy, showed signs of age. Lily, his 12-year-old daughter, was already waiting on the porch when he pulled in. She had inherited her mother's bright eyes and her father's determination. The moment she spotted the trailer, she ran barefoot across the dirt. "A new horse," she called out, her voice filled with excitement. James stepped out of the truck, stretching his sore back. "Yes, something like that." Lily climbed up onto the trailer's side, peeking in. The second she saw Shadow, her face fell. "Dad," she whispered, concern evident in her voice. "He is really skinny." James nodded. "I know." She turned to him, confusion in her eyes. "Did you pick him?" James sighed, rubbing his neck. No one else was going to. For a moment, Lily said nothing. She simply observed the Mustang, her expression unreadable. Then, to James's surprise, she smiled. "Then we just got the best one," she said, nodding confidently. James chuckled despite himself. If only the world worked that way. Opening the trailer door, James expected Shadow to bolt the moment he had the chance, but the Mustang remained frozen in place, his legs stiff and breathing fast. James did not rush him. "Come on, boy, it is all right." Shadow hesitated, then slowly took a single step down the ramp. Lily clapped her hand softly. "Good boy." James led him toward the wooden corral beside the barn. It was not much, but it was safe. Shadow entered with slow, deliberate steps, his eyes darting at every small movement. The trees swayed gently in the wind, a bird alighted on the fence, and the distant sound of cows filled the air. James felt his entire body tense with uncertainty. Lily watched intently and asked, "What is his name?" James pondered for a moment, glancing at the dark-coated Mustang standing in the golden evening light. "Shadow," he replied. Lily beamed. "I like it." However, Shadow appeared indifferent, standing rigidly by the fence, muscles tight like a prisoner in an unfamiliar place. James exhaled. He realized this would require patience. That evening, James poured a small pile of oats into a bucket and made his way to the corral. Shadow stiffened at the sight of him. Crouching down, James placed the bucket near the fence, choosing not to push anything. Shadow's nostrils flared. his body screaming hunger, but his mind urged caution. Minutes ticked by, and just as James was about to lose hope, Shadow took a hesitant step forward, then another, and finally lowered his head to eat. James smiled. It was a small victory, but a start. The following morning, James stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee in hand. The sun was just rising over the horizon, casting a soft golden glow across the land. The crisp air carried the earthy scent of hay. His gaze naturally drifted to the coral, where Shadow stood motionless, just as he had the night before. The Mustang's dark eyes scanned his new surroundings, looking as thin, uncertain, and disconnected as ever. James sighed and took a slow sip of his coffee. He had encountered nervous horses before, but this situation felt different. Shadow was not merely skittish, he was profoundly afraid. Every movement James made, every sound from the ranch, seemed to trigger a buried instinct to flee. Lily appeared beside him, still in her pajamas and rubbing sleep from her eyes. She followed her father's gaze to the coral and frowned. "He does not move much," she observed. James nodded. "No, he is still trying to determine if we are a threat." Lily paused for a moment, then placed her hands on her hips. "I believe he just needs a friend." James chuckled softly. "It is not that simple, kid." "Why not?" she inquired. "Because trust is not given, it is earned." Lily tilted her head and replied, "Then we must start earning it." James finished the last of his coffee and set the mug down on the porch railing. "I had the same thought." He grabbed a lead rope from the barn and approached the coral slowly. Shadow lifted his head, ears flicking toward him, his entire body tense. James kept his movements slow and deliberate. He did not enter the coral immediately. Instead, he leaned against the fence and simply stood there. Minutes passed, and while Shadow did not move, his breathing became more rapid. James remained patient, knowing he was not there to force the horse into submission, but to demonstrate that not all humans were the same. Lily climbed onto the fence beside him, resting her chin on her arms as she observed. "What if he never lets you near him?" James exhaled deeply. "Then I will continue to show up until he does." For the next few hours, James worked around the coral, fixing loose boards, reinforcing the gate, and ensuring the water trough was filled. He never attempted to touch Shadow. He simply allowed the horse to grow accustomed to his presence. At one point, James noticed Shadow flicking his ears forward, observing him more out of curiosity than fear. It was a small victory, but James appreciated it. By the afternoon, he decided to give it another try. This time, he entered the coral, maintaining a relaxed posture and unthreatening movements. Shadow immediately stiffened, nostrils flaring and muscles tensing. James could see the internal struggle happening within the Mustang's mind. To fight or to flee. James moved slowly, his voice calm. "Easy, boy. I am not here to hurt you." Shadow's dark eyes locked onto him, wary and untrusting. Taking another small step forward, James watched as Shadow bolted to the opposite side of the coral, kicking up dust in his retreat. Lily sighed. That was worse than yesterday. James wiped the sweat from his brow. He is just not ready yet. Will he ever be? Lily asked. James looked at the Mustang, standing in the corner with his head low and breathing fast. "Yeah," he said softly, "he will." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, James sat outside, watching the stars begin to twinkle in the sky. His body ached from the long day, but his mind was focused on one thing. Tomorrow, they would try again. This was not just about taming a horse, it was about saving him. The sun was barely up when James made his way back to the coral. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew-covered grass and faint smoke from the old wood-burning stove inside the house. He rested his arms on the top rail, observing Shadow. The Mustang stood near the fence, ears flicking at the sounds of the ranch. His body remained tense, eyes constantly scanning for danger, but he looked less frozen than before. That was an improvement. James glanced at the oats he had brought with him. He needed Shadow to start associating people with something positive instead of fear. He stepped inside the coral, moving slowly, his boots pressing into the dirt. Shadow tensed, nostrils flaring, but he did not bolt. James crouched down, pouring the oats on the ground a few feet away. Just as the day before, he did not force anything. He simply sat down, leaning against the fence, allowing Shadow to decide what to do. Minutes passed, then more. Lily wandered out of the house, rubbing her eyes as she stepped onto the porch. Upon seeing James in the coral, she sighed. "You are just sitting there again." James smirked, eyes still on the Mustang. "Patience, kid." Lily huffed but climbed onto the fence, watching intently. Another few minutes ticked by before Shadow took a slow step forward. James barely breathed. The Mustang hesitated but inched closer to the oats, his muscles still tight and ears flicking back at every small sound. Finally, he lowered his head and began to eat. Lily gasped, "He is eating in front of you." James nodded slowly. "Yes, he is." It was not much, but it was progress. By the afternoon, James decided to push a little further. He had no plans to saddle Shadow yet. That was still too much too soon. However, he wanted the Mustang to get used to the feeling of a rope nearby. He grabbed a lead rope from the fence and re-entered the coral, keeping his movements slow. Shadow immediately stiffened. James did not step closer. He simply held the rope in his hand, allowing Shadow to see it and decide whether to stay or flee. The Mustang's dark eyes locked onto the rope, muscles twitching as his fight-or-flight instincts kicked in. James took one slow step forward. Shadow snorted and bolted to the other side of the coral, kicking up dust in his wake. Lily groaned. "Dad, he was doing so well." James exhaled, wiping the sweat from his brow. "It is part of the process." "But he was finally eating near you." James observed the Mustang from across the coral. His breathing was rapid, chest rising and falling with panic, but something felt different. Shadow did not run as far this time. Instead of retreating to the farthest corner, he stopped midway. He still appeared nervous, but he was watching James instead of running away completely. James smirked. He is still contemplating. Lily frowned, considering this. James chuckled, dusting off his jeans, pondering whether or not Shadow should trust him. That night, James sat outside under the dark sky, observing the stars flicker like tiny lanterns. His body ached from another long day, but his mind was restless. Lily sat beside him on the porch steps, her knees pulled to her chest. "Do you think he will ever let you ride him?" she asked. James took a long breath. "I believe he will." "How do you know?" Lily inquired. James looked toward the coral, where Shadow stood in the moonlight, a horse once discarded, now learning what it meant to be seen. "Because he did not run as far today," James murmured. "That indicates he is starting to wonder if I am different." Lily smiled. "Then we just have to keep showing him that you are." James wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. Tomorrow, they would try again. The morning sun stretched over the ranch, casting long golden rays across the field. James stepped out of the house with a steaming cup of coffee in one hand, his eyes drifting toward the coral. Shadow stood near the fence, his dark coat glistening under the warm light. James could feel it. Something had shifted. The Mustang no longer flinched at every movement. His ears no longer flicked back in fear every time James approached. It had taken patience, silence, and an understanding that trust was something to be earned, not demanded. Today, James would take the next step. Lily walked out onto the porch, stretching the sheet on. She followed her father's gaze toward Shadow and crossed her arms. "You are going to try again today, are you not?" James smirked. "That is obvious. You have that determined look." James took one last sip of his coffee and set the cup down on the railing. "Come on, kid. Let us see what our boy is ready for." Walking toward the coral, James carried a saddle blanket and a bridle. Not a full saddle just yet. Shadow was not ready for that, but he needed to start getting used to the feeling of something on his back. He stepped into the corral, moving slowly and deliberately. Shadow watched him carefully. His body was not as tense as before, but he was still cautious. That was fine. James did not need him to be fearless. He just needed him to stay. James extended the saddle blanket, applying just a little pressure. Easy, boy. Nothing more. Shadow did not move. Gradually, James draped the blanket over his back. Shadow tensed, but did not bolt. James stepped back, giving him space. The Mustang shifted his weight, ears flicking as he felt the unfamiliar pressure. A minute passed, then another. Shadow relaxed. Lily gasped. "Dad, he is allowing you." James let out a slow breath, smiling. "Yes, he is. Now for the real challenge." James picked up the bridle, stepping forward while keeping his voice soft. "All right, boy. This might feel strange, but I promise I will not hurt you." Shadow snorted and took a step back. James stopped and waited. The Mustang hesitated, muscles twitching, then stepped forward again. James reached out and let him sniff the bridle. Shadow's nostrils flared, testing the unfamiliar scent. Then, in a slow, careful motion, James slipped the bridle over his head. Shadow tensed but did not fight it. Lily clapped her hands over her mouth. "Oh my God, Dad, he is letting you do it." James swallowed. His heart pounded. He climbed onto the fence, took a deep breath, and swung his leg over Shadow's back. The Mustang stiffened beneath him. James held his breath. His hands were relaxed on the reins, and his body was steady. He was not forcing anything. Then Shadow took a step forward, and Lily let out a squeal of excitement. "You are riding him. You are actually riding him." James grinned, pride swelling in his chest for his boy. Shadow took another step. His movements were unsure and unsteady, but he was not fighting James. He exhaled. "We are going to be all right, boy." For the first time since he had purchased Shadow at the auction, James truly believed it. They were making progress, one step at a time. The sun barely peeked over the horizon when James stepped out of the house. Today was different. Today was not just about training. It was about proving that Shadow could do what no one believed he could. The Lone Star Endurance Race was only a week away. It was not merely a competition. It was a chance to save the farm. The prize money could cover the debts, repair the fences, and keep their land from slipping through their fingers. But more than that, it was a chance for Shadow to prove that he was not just a discarded horse. James tightened the saddle strap around Shadow's back, giving him a reassuring pat. The Mustang had transformed over the past weeks. His ribs were no longer visible beneath his coat, and his muscles had filled out. He was strong, but more importantly, he now believed in himself. Lily leaned against the fence, watching with eager eyes. "Do you think he is fast enough?" James adjusted his hat and replied, "We will find out." He swung into the saddle, gripping the reins lightly. Shadow stood tall, ears alert and ready. James exhaled, then gave a slight nudge with his heels. Shadow took off like a bullet. The wind rushed past James's face as the Mustang stretched his legs over the open pasture. His hooves pounded the dirt, and his muscles worked effortlessly with each stride. For the first time, Shadow was not running from something. He was running toward it. James guided him through turns, pushing him to accelerate on the straightaways. Shadow was fast, faster than James had ever hoped. When they finally slowed to a trot, Lily jumped up and down on the fence. "Dad, he is amazing." James grinned, running a hand down Shadow's sweaty neck. "Yes, kid, he is." They had a real chance now, but the true test was yet to come. The next morning, James loaded Shadow into the trailer. They were heading into town for a trial run, a smaller endurance race to prepare for the big event. This trial was open to ranchers from all over, and James knew exactly who would be there. William Foster, the man who had laughed at Shadow at the auction. The man who believed that only money could purchase a winning horse. James pulled into the dirt parking lot, stepping out to take in the scene. Riders were already warming up their horses, adjusting saddles, and stretching out stiff muscles. Standing tall beside a gleaming black stallion was Foster. He spotted James immediately and smirked. "Did not expect to see you here, Carter. I thought you had given up on that skeleton of a Mustang by now." James did not take the bait. He unlatched the trailer and led Shadow out. Foster's smirk faltered for just a moment. Shadow looked nothing like the horse he had once dismissed. His coat was smooth, his muscles defined. He looked like a true competitor. Foster scoffed. "I hope you did not bet the farm on this, Carter. You are wasting your time." James ran a hand down Shadow's neck, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. "We shall see about that." The race official blew the whistle. Riders lined up at the starting position. James took a deep breath and whispered to Shadow, "All right, boy, let us show them who you are." The starter pistol fired, and Shadow exploded forward. The race was on. The sound of pounding hooves thundered through the open plains as Shadow surged ahead, his muscles coiled with power. Dust kicked up around them, the wind slicing through James's shirt as they raced neck and neck with some of the best-trained horses in the county. Foster's stallion led the way, its sleek coat shimmering in the sunlight. James could hear Foster's mocking voice echoing in his mind. "That Mustang is worthless. You are wasting your time, Carter." But James knew better. Shadow was built for this. He was not just running. He was fighting for something. James leaned forward, whispering into Shadow's ear, "All right, boy, let us go." Shadow dug deep, pushing harder. His stride stretched longer, his breathing steady, and his speed began to increase as the gap between them and Foster started to close. One by one, they passed riders. The final stretch loomed ahead, a narrow pathway between two steep hills leading to the open field where the finish line awaited. Foster's stallion was still ahead, but Shadow was closing in quickly. Foster glanced back, his smirk replaced by something else. Uncertainty. James felt the energy beneath him. Shadow was not done yet. With a final burst of speed, the Mustang shot forward, overtaking Foster's horse in the last 100 yards. The crowd at the finish line erupted into cheers. James barely registered the sound as Shadow crossed first. He did it. The horse no one wanted. The horse everyone doubted. Lily came running as James slid off the saddle. "Dad, you won." Shadow won. James pressed his forehead against Shadow's damp neck, his heart racing. "Yes, kid, he did." Foster stormed up, his face twisted with frustration. "That was luck." James smiled, rubbing Shadow's mane. "No, Foster, that was heart." A race official approached, handing James an envelope. Inside was the prize money. Enough to save the farm, enough to keep going. As the sun dipped below the horizon, James led Shadow toward the trailer. This time, the Mustang did not hesitate. He walked beside James, his head held high, his step strong. He was no longer a broken horse. He was a champion. And this was just the beginning. Shadow had once been discarded, seen as weak and worthless. But with patience, trust, and determination, he became a champion. This story is not just about a horse. It is about resilience, second chances, and proving that heart matters more than anything. If this story inspired you, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who loves incredible stories of perseverance. Let us know in the comments what your favorite moment from Shadow's journey was. Never underestimate the power of belief. Sometimes, all it takes is one person or one horse to change everything.